Hello and welcome to episode 10 of Novel Approaches, a close readings podcast from the London Review of Books. I'm Thomas Jones, a senior editor at the paper and your host for this episode on The Portrait of a Lady by Henry James, first published in 1881. And to discuss it today, I'm delighted to be joined by Colm Toíbín and Deborah Friedell. Colm is the author of many novels, including, of course, The Master, which, as Michael Wood put it in the LRB, gives us a genuine intimacy with Henry James. Colm's also a contributing editor at the LRB and has written dozens of pieces for the paper, some of which I will be drawing on, or perhaps I should say cribbing from, today. So hello, Colm, and thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Tom. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Deborah Friedell is also a contributing editor at the LRB. She's been writing for the paper since 2007, and she's also, not unlike many Henry James characters, or indeed James himself, an American who has relocated to Europe, living in England like Daniel Touchett, assimilated yet unconverted. So hello, Deborah.
Hello, Tom.
James Wood wrote in the LRB in 2012 that The Portrait of a Lady changed everything in James's career. It is the portal through which the writer we think of as Jamesian or as the master passed. So, Colm, to begin, could you talk a bit about James's life and career and where in that career the Portrait of a Lady hangs?
I think if you compare it to the short novels that have been successful for James before that, Daisy Miller, Washington Square, and you look at the portrait of the young woman in both of those books, in which she really is unself-conscious. For example, Daisy Miller, slightly silly Daisy Miller. In the case of Washington Square, someone who no one rates, someone who no one really wants at their party. And so he has managed to I suppose, to build these heroines on very little substance and to give them very little to work with and sort of punish them in various ways. He kills Daisy Miller and he just simply puts Catherine Sloper in Washington Square into a sort of living grave. It was Washington Square gave him the confidence in a way because it made money. It was serialized on both sides of the Atlantic, which mattered to him, to embark on Portrait of a Lady. But there was a blueprint before it, a story he wrote in the 1860s called Poor Richard, very quickly after he had been with his cousin Minnie Temple and a number of young men who were eligible. And he wrote a story about these men gathering around this woman called Gertrude Whittaker. So in other words, you have the heroine and you have the number of men, different sorts of men, including Poor Richard, who's very ill and unwell, but these very strong men who've been in the military. This is after the American Civil War. And you can see that this is the configuration that continues to interest him. The single woman, this brilliant figure, and these young men, or these men from particular aspects of life who want her and who she will, in fact, disdain. And so the configuration has been with him really for more than a decade. But an idea has come to him, which arises, I suppose, out of Daisy Miller, the sort of guilt over writing Daisy Miller, which is, imagine if she were a sort of new American girl, that she were someone who didn't want rank in life, didn't want to marry a duke, didn't care about 10,000 a year, but wanting something spiritual, something that couldn't be named from life. And so marriage for her would be something much grander, much more interesting than the mere business of settling down with someone who has more money than you have or who can give you a sort of place in society. T.S. Eliot talked about James having a mind so fine that it couldn't be penetrated by an idea. But this is an idea. And this is an idea where it's something James has noticed, that there is a distinct difference emerging between the sort of woman that his cousin was, Minnie Temple, who is dead by this time, or the sort of women who are part of that circle in Boston, all of whom will marry very badly, including Oliver Wendell Holmes' wife, including Clover Hooper, who married Henry Adams, that these women wanted more from life than a husband could give. And so imagine if you could dramatize this. You could give somebody, not that she's seeking a husband, but that she has some of the moral ardor of someone like Dorothea in Middlemarch. And of course, James was also paying huge attention to George Eliot, but he realized there was something else he could do. There was something else he knew that no one else knew. He knew what a serious woman, young woman in America, especially in New England, could be like and what she could do and what she could mean and how you could dramatize her. And so in doing that, as James was right, that he had to give her a sort of flickering, shimmering, uneasy consciousness, which would never settle, she's not just a born noticer. She's someone whose interior life is mysterious and rich and not particularly easy to describe. And this, of course, becomes a huge challenge for him, how to make her fascinating and interesting without being able to give her easy to name characteristics.
Yeah. I mean, that question about reading George Eliot and so on, I mean, there's this, and as you say, that James is very cruel to Daisy Miller, that there's one point where Isabel says of the English, I don't believe they're very nice to girls. They're not nice to them in the novels. And I'm not sure on that if she's thinking that the novelists are not very nice to girls or if the English characters in the novels. But is James nice to Isabel? Is that a fair question to ask?
Well, what's interesting, and I mean, it's very hard to write about James as the gay novelist or the James that is, if you just look at him from that angle. But he does punish her, and he does punish Daisy Miller, and he does punish Catherine Sloper. That in other words, she comes with such sort of rich ambitions. That opening scene where she appears, she's such a golden wonder who has come from America. She's so charming, she's so tactful, she's so careful, she's so curious. And there's a moment where she says to Ralph Touchett, almost as a sort of an American English joke, oh, is there a ghost in Gardencourt? Is there a ghost in the house? And the answer is, well, yes, but not. You're too young and innocent to be able to see the ghost. And then by the end of the book, there's an extraordinary moment where she does see the ghost, and you realize what she's learned, the knowledge she has got, is sort of bitter knowledge. But it is a thing that's happening in the English novel anyway. Speaking of what being nice to girls in novels, if you go back to Trollope and look at, say, Phineas Finn and just say Lady Laura Kennedy. And again, you have that configuration. Lady Laura Kennedy can really only speak to Phineas Finn, who's a bachelor in London, but she's married to a bully. And that business of it isn't the marriage that matters. It's the bullying later. It's the fact that a very sensitive and ambitious and intelligent woman is being crushed by this man, which of course occurs. George Eliot becomes one of her great subjects is, what happens to Gwendolen in Daniel Deronda when she marries Grandcourt. What happens to Dorothea when she marries Casaubon. So it isn't something that James invented, this idea of getting a young woman of a certain type who the reader begins to I suppose, feel close to. And the author builds up this idea that you as the reader, this is the person you're most attending to. And then you watch this person being destroyed. It's a big 19th century idea. So it's not just James doing it. But there is a sense in which Isabel, that the way in which those scenes with Ralph towards the end, where she just says, in all innocence, I married him.
So, Deborah, how is that destruction of Isabel Archer? How does that take place? What is I know that James didn't like the word plot, but what is the plot of The Portrait of a Lady?
Yeah, so in the novel's preface, as you just alluded to, James admits that he's often accused of not having enough story in his work. And, he refers to basic novelistic plotting as nefarious. Other writers, he suggests, might throw in pirates and surprises. He says, that's not me. He's interested in inner drama, the drama of the interior life, and in the way consciousness, choice, perception shape human experience. But all that said, he definitely tells a story. He takes up the familiar framework of the 19th century marriage plot that we've been covering on this podcast, and he remakes it. So James tells us he built the novel around the observation of a single character's mind, in this case, that of an intelligent but presumptuous American girl. When the novel starts, Isabel Archer's in her early 20s. She's an orphan living in Albany, that's upstate New York. And into her life comes an aunt, one she's never met before, called Mrs. Touchett, who has an unusual marriage. She lives for most of the year in Florence, but for 1 month in the summer lives in the English countryside with her husband, a shrewd American banker, now dying. And Mrs. Touchett proposes to take Isabel with her back to Europe. And Isabel's absolutely up for it. We're told she's longing to put the past behind her and begin afresh. And one of the things it seems she wants to put behind her is a forceful, big, virile American man, Caspar Goodwood. Isabel thinks that she never encouraged him outright, but she also hasn't been unequivocal in turning him away. So she arrives at her uncle's grand house in the English countryside. She meets her cousin Ralph, who has consumption. He's fragile. Like his father, he's also dying, but he really enjoys being with Isabel, and he admires her. He thinks she has spirit. She meets his aristocratic friend, Lord Warburton, who's extremely pleasant, handsome, well-made, absurdly wealthy. And he's possibly James's idea of the perfect suitor. He's Mr. Darcy at the end of Pride and Prejudice, only softer, more pliant, politically progressive. But Isabel rejects him. So just a word of warning, if you're ever thrown into a novel by Henry James and you come across a woman who's able to, speak multiple languages and is well-traveled, composed, impeccably behaved, socially confident, glides effortlessly through salons, maybe unusually good at playing bridge, watch out. So Isabel comes across Serena Merle, expertly playing the piano, and is immediately impressed with her and smitten. And Madame Merle takes Isabel under her wing. Sir Ralph, Isabel's cousin who loves her, persuades his father to change his will to leave Isabel a fortune. And after Mr. Touchett dies and Isabel inherits £70,000, Madame Merle engineers Isabel's introduction to her old friend, Gilbert Osmond, a widower living in Florence who has a teenage daughter. And Osmond has little money, but seemingly exquisite taste. And even though Osmond's an American, he's lived so long in Italy that he seems to Isabel to embody European sophistication. And then the novel skips ahead. Several years into the future, Isabel's now married to Osmond. We've bypassed the proposal, the wedding, the first years of married life. We get to the point when Isabel is an unhappily married lady. She's belatedly discovered Osmond's coldness and self-interest. She, slowly discovers that Gilbert Osmond and Madame Merle had once been secret adulterous lovers and that Madame Merle's the real mother of Osmond's daughter. And Isabel cares deeply for that girl. She's called Pansy, and Pansy begs Isabel not to abandon her, and Isabel promises. She says, "I won't desert you." And we realize that James was all along probably less interested in the question of who's the heroine going to marry than in how will the heroine come to understand her marriage or to endure her marriage. And against Osmond's wishes, Isabel insists on going to England in time to be with Ralph as he dies. She's reunited with Caspar Goodwood, her American beau, who tries to persuade her to let him help her. He wants her to remake her life with him. He begs her, he kisses her, but she can't do it. She goes back to Italy, and we don't know what happens next.
You can listen to the full episode and all our other Close Reading series by signing up to our Close Reading subscription. If you're listening in Apple, you can do that just by going to the top of this podcast. Or for Spotify and other podcast apps, go to lrb.me/audio or click on the link in the description.